Imagine it's 1st December 2001. You are a 46-year-old shopkeeper living in Buenos Aires, Argentina. You open the metal shutter of your small appliance store just after sunrise, the same way you have for 18 years, with one hand on the lock and the other holding a paper cup of bitter coffee. Your wife keeps the books at the kitchen table every night your daughter is saving for university, and most of your family savings sit in a bank account you chose because it felt solid, modern, almost untouchable. You do not feel rich, but you feel careful. You pay taxes, you keep receipts, and you trust that the dollars and pesos on your monthly bank statement are waiting for you the way winter coats wait in a closet. On weekends, you walk past the branch on Avenida Rivadavia without even looking at it. Why would you? The money is yours. The bank is just the building that holds it. If you have ever wondered why perfectly normal people can work for years, save carefully, do everything right, and still wake up one morning unable to reach their own money, stay with me. What you are about to hear is not a theory. It is a pattern. It has happened before, in rich countries and poor ones, in old crises and recent ones. And if you find value in this kind of historical clarity, subscribing takes 2 seconds and keeps you ahead of what most people never see coming. Then the radio changes tone. Economy Minister Domingo Cavallo has announced emergency restrictions. The word that will soon spread through the country is corralito, a little corral, a pen that keeps animals from running. It sounds almost harmless. It is not. Starting that weekend, cash withdrawals are limited to 250 pesos or dollars per week for each account holder at each bank. Transfers abroad are largely blocked. By Monday, lines coil around city blocks, people bang pots in the streets. Small business owners stare at payroll dates like men watching dark clouds roll over a field. And suddenly the truth becomes visible. A bank deposit is not a pile of cash with your name on it. It is a promise. Most of the time that promise works so smoothly that it feels like reality. But history shows that when pressure builds, the difference between money you own and money a bank owes you can become the most important difference in your life. Before we go further, there is something important to understand. The deposit secret is not that banks are evil or that every bank is about to fail. The secret is simpler, colder, and more unsettling than that. When you deposit money, you usually do not place your exact bills into a private box and leave them there like jars on a pantry shelf. In legal terms, what you hold is a claim against the bank. The Federal Reserve has put it plainly. A deposit is a liability of the bank, which means the bank owes you that amount. But you do not own specific bank assets sitting somewhere with your name attached. The Bank of England has been equally direct about the modern system. Banks do not simply take savings and pass them along like a bucket brigade. When they make loans, they create deposits. In other words, the banking system runs on promises, balance sheets, and confidence. Think of it like a hotel. Every guest believes the front desk can hand over a room key at any moment, and on a normal night, it can. But now imagine the hotel has used tomorrow's bookings, next month's maintenance budget, and a loan against the building itself to keep operating. The business still works as long as not everyone demands the same thing at once. A bank does something similar, though on a far more complex scale. It offers depositors immediate access to money on demand, while the assets behind those deposits are often tied up in long-term loans, government bonds, mortgages, and other things that cannot be turned into cash instantly without pain. Economists call this maturity transformation. In plain English, it means borrowing short and lending long. It is like promising your neighbor you can return his ladder any minute while you are still standing on the roof. Most of the time, this system helps economies grow. It lets banks fund homes, farms, factories, and businesses, but it also means the calm you feel when you check your balance depends on a chain of conditions staying intact. Confidence must hold, asset values must hold, funding must hold, political authorities must hold. Once that chain starts to snap, depositors discover that their money was never sleeping quietly in a vault. It was swimming through the financial system like water moving through pipes. And when the pipes crack, the faucet in your kitchen is where you first notice the loss of pressure. This brings us directly to the first part of the story. The oldest version of the deposit secret is not that access can be limited, it is that access can disappear, even in a country people think of as permanent and safe. In the United States, from 1930 to 1933, approximately 9,000 banks suspended operations as the Great Depression deepened. This was not one dramatic explosion, it was more like termites in the beams of a house. From the street, the house still looked upright. Inside, the structure was weakening month by month. Then confidence broke. By early March 1933, fear had spread so far that state after state was closing banks or restricting withdrawals. On March 6th, President Franklin Roosevelt ordered a national bank holiday. For 1 week, banking transactions across America were suspended. Imagine what that meant in ordinary life. You could not simply tap a phone or use a card. Americans could not withdraw money, transfer funds, or even make deposits. Many struggled to cash paychecks. Stores extended credit for basic food. Money orders were generally capped at $100. In one Bronx traffic court, some people chose one-day jail sentences rather than hand over scarce cash for fines of $2 to $5. That detail matters because it shows what crises really are. They are not charts. They are moments when a small fine, a loaf of bread, or a train ticket becomes a test of dignity. Look at what happened next. Congress passed the Emergency Banking Act on March 9th. Banks in Federal Reserve cities began reopening on March 13th. By March 15th, banks controlling 90% of the country's banking resources had resumed operations. But 4,000 banks never reopened. The ground had split. People who thought a bank account was the firmest floor in the world had learned that it could act more like ice in spring. Hard one day, water the next. Now here's where it gets interesting. The system did not recover because Americans suddenly became brave. It recovered because the state made the promise more believable. Roosevelt spoke directly to the public in his fireside chat. The government changed the regime, which means it changed the rules of the game in a way people found credible. The New York Fed later noted that more than half of the cash Americans had hoarded came back into banks within 2 weeks of reopening. And on January 1st, 1934, federal deposit insurance began, initially protecting up to $2,500 per depositor. That limit sounds tiny now, but the principle was enormous. The system had admitted its basic weakness. If depositors are just unsecured promises facing a fragile chain of confidence, then confidence itself has to be publicly defended. The lesson from 1933 is not only that bank runs happen, it is that the modern deposit is a social bargain. It works because people believe they will be paid, and because governments stand behind that belief when panic hits. Remove the belief, and even a great banking nation can freeze like a river under black winter ice. Here is something I want you to think about before we go further. If your bank statement says the money is there, but your access to it depends on confidence, liquidity, and political decisions, do you really own a stored thing, or do you own a conditional promise? Drop your answer in the comments. Seriously. Because what I'm about to show you next is the part of this story that most people never hear, and it changes everything. The second part of this story begins where many depositors make a fatal mental mistake. They assume the danger starts when a bank is already dead. History shows something harsher. Deposits can be trapped while the system is still trying to save itself. Argentina in 2001 is one of the clearest examples. For years, the country had lived under convertibility, a currency system that tied the peso to the US dollar at 1-to-1. On the surface, it offered order. Underneath, it created rigid pressure. By 1998, recession had set in. By 2001, capital flight, money racing out of the country, was intensifying. The IMF later described the Argentine banking system as having been considered a model for emerging markets before depositor runs accelerated in the spring of 2001. That is important. The trap often springs not when a system already looks ridiculous, but when it still looks respectable. So return to that shopkeeper in Buenos Aires. He has invoices to pay. He has customers who now want discounts in cash. He has suppliers who trust nothing. And as the run builds, the government does not say, "We are taking your money forever." It says something softer. Temporary measures, emergency steps, necessary stabilization. This is how history usually speaks right before it closes the gate. Under the corralito rules that took effect from December 1st, 2001, depositors could withdraw no more than 250 pesos or dollars in cash per week from accounts at each financial institution. The general rule also blocked transfers of funds abroad. Salaries and pensions had limited exceptions, but the message was unmistakable. The door had not been welded shut, but it had narrowed to a slot. And this is where history gets uncomfortable. Once money is trapped, time starts working against ordinary people. A wealthy firm can hire lawyers. A politically connected insider may already have moved funds. A family with foreign income can improvise. But the middle-class saver, the pensioner, the cashier, the small importer, the pharmacy owner, the man with all his working capital inside the same banking system, they are like passengers on a train whose doors lock while the track ahead is being torn up. By late December, Argentina partly defaulted on its international obligations. In January 2002, the convertibility regime was abandoned. Then came pesofication, the forced conversion of dollar-denominated contracts and deposits into pesos at different rates. That phrase sounds technical. In ordinary language, it meant many savers who thought they held dollars inside the system found themselves pushed into a weakening currency instead. The IMF later argued that the legally ambiguous blocking of deposits and the forced conversion of dollar assets and liabilities compounded the crisis and turned it into a full-blown banking disaster. For ordinary people, the experience was more brutal than the legal language suggests. Imagine running a small store and being unable to pay suppliers except through channels they no longer trust. Imagine parents standing outside banks with passbooks in hand, not to withdraw wealth, but to buy groceries, school books, or medicine. Imagine years of caution melting in public, under fluorescent branch lights, while television commentators explain that the system must be stabilized. Collapse is rarely a bomb. It is more like being buried by snow. At first it seems light, then you notice your legs are gone. What did some survivors do differently? Not perfectly, not magically. But many who came through Argentina least damaged were those who understood, before the official break, that a bank balance was not the same thing as control. Some held assets outside the banking system. Some kept part of their liquidity in cash. Some used deposits early to buy durable goods, inventory, or foreign assets before the forced conversions deepened. The point is not to romanticize cleverness. It is to observe that those who treated the bank statement as a promise instead of a possession had more room to move when the promise was rewritten. Now we move to a smaller island with a lesson large countries studied very carefully. Cyprus in 2013 showed that depositors can do everything right, keep money inside the formal system, and still be drafted into the rescue itself. This is the third form of the deposit secret. Sometimes the deposit does not just get frozen, it gets turned into bank capital. That means your savings become part of the repair bill. Cyprus had built a banking sector far larger than its domestic economy. When losses piled up and the system needed rescue, European authorities and the Cypriot government reached for a tool that many ordinary savers barely knew existed: the bail-in. A bailout uses outside support, often public money, to keep a bank alive. A bail-in pushes losses inward onto creditors inside the bank, and depositors above the insured limit can be treated as those creditors. Notice how the quiet legal truth of a deposit returns at the exact moment people most wish it were false. In March 2013, banks shut their doors. Capital controls followed. Cypriots could withdraw only €300 per day. Travelers faced strict limits on how much cash they could take abroad. Businesses faced review committees for larger payments. Then came the deepest shock. On July 30th, Cyprus's central bank announced that 47.5% of deposits above €100,000 at Bank of Cyprus would be converted into equity to recapitalize the bank. In simpler terms, nearly half of large uninsured deposits were taken and turned into shares. At Laiki Bank, large depositors were hit even harder as the bank was resolved, which is the formal word for dismantled. Formal words are often silk laid over barbed wire. Think about the psychology of this. You are not a reckless trader. You did not buy a strange derivative, a complicated financial contract most normal people never touch. You kept money in a bank. You may have been a hotel owner saving for repairs, a family business keeping payroll, a professional setting aside tax payments, or a retiree who sold property and parked the proceeds in what seemed like the safest place available. Then one morning you learn that the money above the official insurance line is not really money in the ordinary sense. It is shock absorber material. It is the part of the building authorities can tear out to keep the walls standing. The same mechanism, different country, different decade, same result. Short-term promises had been laid over long-term and impaired assets. Confidence broke. Authorities had to choose who would bear the loss. And once again, the deposit was revealed to be something more fragile than the word sounds. A deposit is a calm word. It sounds like sediment at the bottom of a lake, settled and still. In a crisis, it is closer to a seat on a crowded lifeboat, secure until the boat takes on water. One more brief stop matters because it rhymes with the present. In September 2007, Northern Rock in the United Kingdom needed emergency support from the Bank of England. On September 14th, after that support became public, depositors began lining up outside branches. The government then moved to stop the panic, announcing on September 17th that all existing deposits in Northern Rock would be guaranteed, and later extending protection to new retail deposits made after September 19th. The point is not that Britain had become Argentina. It had not. The point is that even in a wealthy, highly regulated country, the ancient scene can return in a single weekend. The line outside the bank was not a relic from old black and white photographs. It was modern. And today the line does not even need a pavement. It can form inside phones. Rumor moves at the speed of a screenshot. Transfers move in seconds. The old weakness has not disappeared. Short-term promises are still laid over longer-term assets. History's costume changes. The mechanism stays the same. And as British lawmakers later noted, depositors were behaving rationally and logically once the run was visible. That is how these events spread. Fear does not need madness. It only needs people realizing that if everyone else can move first, waiting politely becomes the risky choice. Most people will never know what you now know. Most people will keep trusting systems they do not understand. If you are still here, you are not most people. Hit subscribe. Because the next section is the part this channel was made for, the part they never put in textbooks. Now look at all three together. America in 1933, Argentina in 2001, Cyprus in 2013, different languages, different institutions, different political systems, but the same underlying machine. Banks promise depositors immediate access. Banks hold assets that do not become immediate cash without stress. Governments and central banks try to keep the bridge standing. When enough pressure builds, somebody absorbs the delay, the loss, or the restriction. Sometimes it is the bank, sometimes it is the state. Very often, in one way or another, it is the depositor. At this point, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. First, deposits feel like stored property in good times, even though legally they are claims on a bank. Second, banks fund long-term assets with short-term promises, which works beautifully until confidence falters. Third, once panic begins, authorities do not ask one simple moral question: whose money is this? They ask a harder systemic question: how do we stop the whole structure from collapsing today? Those are not the same question. And when the second question takes over, ordinary people discover that their private savings were resting on public choices all along. Now observe what all of these cases have in common. The damage rarely starts with the old image of mobs smashing bank windows. It usually starts quietly in balance sheets, funding markets, exchange rates, sovereign debt, and policy delays. The rot is in the beams, not on the wallpaper. By the time lines form outside branches, the real crisis has already been alive for months or years. This is why every episode feels sudden to the public and predictable in retrospect to historians. A deposit crisis is like a dam failure. The village hears the roar at the end. Engineers could see the stress long before. And there is another pattern people miss. The official language in these episodes is almost always temporary. Bank holiday, stabilization, capital controls, emergency liquidity, resolution, burden sharing. These phrases are not lies exactly, but they are not how depositors experience events. Depositors experience missed payroll, rationed cash, frozen transfers, shrinking purchasing power, and the sickening realization that the safest money they had was safe only under conditions that no longer exist. This leads to the human cost, which is where the story stops being abstract. Greece in 2015 did not erase deposits outright the way Cyprus treated some large accounts, but it showed how quickly a modern European banking system could turn from normal convenience into controlled access. After months of failed negotiations over Greece's debts, the government announced capital controls on June 28, 2015. A bank holiday would last until July 6th. ATM withdrawals were limited to €60 per day. Greek banks had already been living on emergency liquidity assistance from the European Central Bank. By the end of May 2015, private sector deposits in Greek banks had fallen to €130 billion from €164 billion in November 2014. That is a €34 billion retreat in just months, like water draining out of a reservoir, while officials insist the dam is stable. If you want to know what a deposit crisis feels like on the ground, do not start with bond charts. Start with a pensioner in line before dawn. Start with a restaurant owner calculating whether imported cooking oil will arrive. Start with a parent staring at an ATM screen as if a machine can be persuaded by worry. €60 a day is not nothing, but it is not normal access either. It turns adults back into ration card managers, measuring dignity in banknotes. In crises, time itself becomes a toll booth. Every extra day of limited access punishes the least flexible people first. Look at who feels it hardest. The wealthy can often wait. The globally connected can reroute. Large firms may negotiate, but pensioners, wage earners, small retailers, and anyone who lives close to the monthly edge feel the clamp first. They are the ones whose financial lives run on timing, not just totals. Missing a supplier payment can break a business even if the account still shows money on paper. Missing a rent payment can break a household even if a bank calls the restriction temporary. In this sense, a frozen deposit is like food locked behind glass. Technically it exists. Practically it is gone. And then we arrive at Lebanon, where the modern deposit secret took on perhaps its cruelest recent form. By October 2019, according to the World Bank, Lebanon plunged into a financial crisis, triggered by a sudden stop in capital inflows. Banks imposed de facto capital controls. which means controls in practice, even if not fully built into a clear legal framework at first. Depositors were largely locked out of their dollar accounts and blocked from sending money abroad. Reuters reported in June 2021 that the main way many Lebanese could access dollar deposits was to withdraw in local currency at a fixed rate of 3,900 Lebanese pounds to the dollar, while the black market rate was around 13,000. That meant people were effectively accepting a massive loss just to touch their own savings. One analyst put it bluntly, people were begging for a 70% loss on the value of their deposits. Read that again in human terms. Not investors begging for a return, workers begging to recover part of what they had already earned. Since late 2019, Lebanon's pound lost around 90% of its value. The World Bank said GDP fell from roughly $55 billion in 2018 to about $33 billion in 2020, while GDP per person fell around 40% in dollar terms. It called the crisis one of the most severe in the world since the mid-19th century, possibly among the top three. More than half the population likely fell below the poverty line. The burden, the World Bank said, was highly regressive, concentrated on smaller depositors, smaller businesses, and the bulk of the labor force paid in lira. This is the part that cuts deepest. In Lebanon, the deposit did not vanish with one dramatic confiscation. It decayed in slow motion. A bank balance became a photograph of former purchasing power. People still saw numbers on screens, but the real world attached different prices to those numbers every week. A deposit in that environment is like an ice cube on a hot pavement. It still has shape, it is still technically there, but every minute changes its meaning. So who walks away fine in these episodes? Usually not the people history textbooks focus on, not the careful school teacher, not the retired clerk, not the pharmacy owner. The historical record shows that those with early information, political access, offshore options, foreign income, hard assets, or simple geographical flexibility tend to bear the shock differently. They are not always immune, but they are rarely trapped in the same way. The system squeezes hardest where lives are local, savings are concentrated, and trust was deepest. That is why deposit crises feel like moral betrayals, not just financial accidents. They punish the behavior people were told was prudent. The question is not whether this pattern will repeat. History has already answered that. The only question is whether you will see it before it sees you. If this channel helps you think differently about the world you live in, subscribe. It costs nothing, and it might change everything. So what did the survivors, or at least the least damaged, seem to have in common across these episodes? Not one magic asset, not one ideology, not one perfect forecast. The historical record shows that those who came through these periods largely shared three broad characteristics. First, they understood the difference between access and ownership. They did not confuse a bank balance with a pile of ready cash under all conditions. That sounds obvious only after a crisis. Before a crisis, it feels almost rude to say aloud. Second, they avoided single-point dependence. Again, this is not a recommendation, it is a pattern. In many episodes, the people hurt worst were those whose wages, savings, bill payments, and business working capital all flowed through one fragile channel. Survivors often had options. Some had part of their money outside the most exposed institutions. Some had income from abroad. Some held inventory, land, tools, or durable goods that kept value better than trapped bank balances. Some simply moved faster when warning signs became impossible to ignore. In Greece, people who had already reduced exposure before the final controls had more flexibility. In Cyprus, balances below the insured threshold were treated differently from larger uninsured sums. In Argentina and Lebanon, families with some cash, foreign notes, remittance income, or hard goods had a margin of movement others lacked. Optionality is a cold word. In hard times, it means breathing room. Third, they responded to incentives, not slogans. When official language grew reassuring but conditions kept worsening, they paid more attention to the widening gap than to the comforting words. History is full of people who did not predict the exact day of closure, yet still noticed the pattern: falling reserves, soaring withdrawal demand, political paralysis, dependence on emergency liquidity, unstable exchange rates, and quiet restrictions dressed up as technical adjustments. They did not need prophecy. They needed pattern recognition. In a deposit crisis, the winners are rarely the loudest. They are often the first to admit that the floor beneath them may not be as solid as it feels. There is a final irony here. The banking system depends on trust, and trust is not foolish. Civilized economies cannot function if everyone behaves as if every bank will close tomorrow. The point of this history is not paranoia, it is clarity. Banks are necessary. Deposits are useful. Deposit insurance and central bank backstops matter enormously. But trust without structure is sentiment, and sentiment is a bridge made of fog. The people who survive these periods best are often the ones who trust institutions only as far as the underlying mechanics deserve. So return to Buenos Aires. Return to that shopkeeper on the first morning of December 2001. He opened his store believing his savings were resting in the bank the way dishes rest in a cupboard, waiting to be taken down when needed. By the end of the crisis, he understood something far harsher. His money had not been sitting still. It had been part of a system under strain, a network of promises tied to a state, a currency regime, and a confidence game in the neutral sense of the phrase, a structure that works only while confidence holds. Once the chain snapped, his statement balance and his actual freedom were no longer the same thing. That is the deposit secret banks rarely explain in ordinary language. Your deposit is usually not a stored object. It is a promise from a leveraged institution, a heavily borrowed institution, operating inside a political and monetary system that can change the rules under stress. Most of the time, that promise is reliable enough to feel invisible. In a crisis, invisibility ends. And when it ends, ordinary people discover that the safest-looking part of their financial life may have depended on the most fragile assumption of all, that tomorrow will look enough like today for the promise to remain simple. History does not say every bank is unsafe. It does not say every depositor will be trapped. It does say something more useful. It says that when you study 1933 in the United States, 2001 in Argentina, 2013 in Cyprus, 2015 in Greece, and 2019 in Lebanon, the same lesson keeps returning in different clothes. A deposit is liquid until the system needs it not to be. A guarantee is firm until politics, arithmetic, or panic tests its edges. And the people hurt worst are usually the ones who are most obedient to the ordinary story. This is historical and educational analysis. It is not financial advice. Every individual situation is different. Please consult a qualified professional before making any financial decision. This video is not for everyone. Most people will dismiss it, but if one person in your life needs to hear this, share it with them. Not because it will change the world, because it might change their world. Subscribe for more, and I will see you in the next one.